Hello, welcome to Building Serverless Web Applications with AWS Amplify. My name is Nader Dabbit. I'm a developer advocate for AWS Mobile. And as a developer advocate, we spend most of our time writing documentation, writing blog posts, speaking at conferences, and talking with developers. And one of the products that I'm really excited about, or one of the libraries and CLIs that I'm really excited about, and a CLI that was actually just released maybe a week ago, is the AWS Amplify CLI. Today we're going to be talking about the entire AWS Amplify ecosystem, because now with the addition of the CLI, we have a complete toolkit to do a lot of really interesting stuff. So in this presentation, really, we're going to be going through an end-to-end presentation about how to get up and running with this. We're also going to walk through how to use AWS Amplify in an actual client-side application and kind of get up and running with that. So to get started, I'll talk about what AWS Amplify is. And to kind of make it concise, it's a CLI and a tool chain for the client. And really, it's a CLI and a client-side library, but the CLI does a lot more, so we're kind of calling it a tool chain as well, because we do a lot of code generation and things like that as well. So we'll split this up into kind of two pieces, the CLI and the client library. The CLI is something you'll install in your terminal or in your command line, and you'll be able to create and configure AWS services directly from your front-end environment. The actual AWS Amplify JavaScript library will allow you to take those resources that you created with the CLI and connect into the JavaScript application that you're working with and interact with the different services that you've scaffolded through the CLI. And we're going to look at how to kind of take these two pieces, put them together to kind of rapidly build applications. So what kind of services can you build and interact with using Amplify? Well, these are the ones that we have right now. You have the opportunity to work with the database. You can do a lot of different stuff, but first class, you can work with DynamoDB, but you can also do things through some of the other services that access different RDS and Elasticsearch and SQL type of databases. We have an API service that allows you to scaffold and set up a complete end-to-end API. And there are a few different APIs that you can actually create. You can work with REST APIs. You can work with custom APIs that you build through AWS Lambda Functions, GraphQL APIs, a lot of really interesting stuff. There's also a way to set up Lambda and serverless functions. And this is a really nice way to kind of get up and running with Lambda directly from your front-end environment without going into the AWS Console. You can add authentication really easily, and with authentication, you can then do authorization on different endpoints. You can set up analytics through Amazon Pinpoint. We offer hosting, so if you're developing a web application and you'd like to publish it live, you can do that directly from the command line. And also storage, and storage is going to be done through Amazon S3. So we'll go into each of these services a little bit more in depth. So as far as authentication is going to be done using Amazon Cognito. And using the CLI, you can create and configure new Amazon Cognito resources for user sign-in, sign-up, and you can do a lot of the different things that you'll need to do in this environment of working with users, such as forgetting passwords and doing multi-factor authentication, and even doing things like time-based one-time passwords. So if you've ever used a service like Google Authenticator, where you'd like to do a really more sophisticated user authentication scenario, you can do that. You can also interact with all these different Cognito services using the AWS Amplify JavaScript library. So you can create the resource and then interact with it from your application. And to kind of top it off, we also have pre-configured components that you can use for your JavaScript library of choice. So you can work directly using the JavaScript classes that aren't really library specific, but if you're using React, React Native, Angular, or Ionic, and also Vue actually has been added recently, you can actually use pre-configured components to do things like an entire user authorization flow or user authentication flow. So instead of having to write a sign-up form, a sign-in form, and kind of take into consideration password, someone forgetting their password, you can actually use a single component with just a couple of lines of code and get all of that functionality out of the box using one of these pre-configured components. Next, we'll talk about analytics. For analytics, we're going to be working with Amazon Pinpoint. From the CLI, you can create and configure a new Amazon Pinpoint resource. And once the resource is created, you can then interact with the Amazon Pinpoint service directly, again, from your JavaScript application. Not only can you manually send events and record events, but Pinpoint will automatically record session data if you've set up your authentication already. So for instance, if a user just downloads your application or lands on your application, we'll automatically record that session data without you having to do anything. You also have authentication data that's recorded for things like user sign-in and user sign-up. And if you have any errors that are going on through your user sign-in or user sign-up process, we'll actually record the error data so you can kind of know exactly what's going on. So for instance, if you have a bunch of users that try to sign up, but their password is not strong enough, you can kind of get a good idea that maybe your password authentication process, the restrictions are a little bit too much, and you can kind of lean back on those, so you get really good information there. And that actually gets set up out of the box without you having to do anything. Next, we'll talk about a couple of the different APIs that are available that can be scaffolded. The first is a REST API. So a REST API that you typically might actually create by hand with, I don't know, a few hundred lines of code, having to write a Lambda function and write maybe a serverless REST API that handles different routes. This can be done in just a single line from your command line now. And the REST API that is going to be like a generic starter for the CLI is using AWS Lambda and API Gateway. So when you scaffold a new API, a new REST API from your command line, it'll create the Lambda function, and it'll also automatically scaffold all of the Lambda code to handle a boilerplate for you, or to kind of create a boilerplate for you to get started. It'll also configure API Gateway, so you can then begin sending requests directly to your API without having to do any configuration in the AWS console. It's all kind of handled for you from the CLI. Once the actual API is created, then you can then use the JavaScript library to start interacting with the API. We also have a GraphQL API. So if you're interested in working with GraphQL, AWS has a managed GraphQL service called AWS AppSync. And you can either, of course, get up and running with AppSync in the dashboard, but if you're using the Amplify CLI, you can actually scaffold new GraphQL APIs directly from your command line. Not only can you create the different AppSync endpoints, but you can configure them as well. And then once your API is ready to go, you can start performing queries, mutations, and different events to the API directly from your JavaScript app. Similar to how with the authentication workflow that we had, you can also use pre-configured components for React, React Native, Angular, and Vue for doing different GraphQL operations or GraphQL AppSync operations. So for instance, you can do things like have a pre-configured component that will render any type of queries for you directly from the React or React Native libraries. And then the final API that you can get up and running with using the CLI is a database API. And the database API is going to be using a combination of DynamoDB, an AWS Lambda function, and Amazon API Gateway. So you can configure and create the API directly from the command line. That will go ahead and scaffold the DynamoDB table. It'll create the Lambda function, and it'll write out some boilerplate code for you, as well as configure the API Gateway. Once the API is created, again, you can start interacting with the API directly from your JavaScript application. So you can do things like sending post, get, update, and delete functions to your API directly from your JavaScript side without having to write a lot of intermediate code that handles the actual Lambda function. That is all kind of handled for you. Also, we keep talking about Lambda functions and how Lambda functions are being used in a lot of these REST API resources, but you can also create a standalone AWS Lambda function. So you can create the Lambda function, push changes to your Lambda function. You can actually test the function locally. So once your function is up and running, instead of having to hit it from your JavaScript application, you can invoke the functions locally from your command line, which is really cool. And you can also, of course, interact with the Lambda functions using the JavaScript Client Library. If you would like to host your website on Amazon S3 or with AWS in general, it makes it super easy. If you use the CLI, you run, I think, 2 commands, and it'll create and configure the S3 bucket for hosting. It'll push all of your assets, your entire web directory will go and be pushed up to S3, and then you can automatically from there start interacting with it using an HTTP address. And then if you have any updates to your website, you can then just push those changes whenever you have them ready, and your S3 bucket will be updated as well as your website. Then if you'd like to kind of use your own custom domain, you can take whatever you have there and just route everything through Route 53, and then you can have your own custom domain and continue that workflow from your command line. Finally, storage. This is a big one. This is one that has been used a lot for sure. Amazon S3, you can create and configure S3 buckets from your command line, and then you can manage user content from your app using the Amplify library. So let's look at how to get started, and we're going to walk through this in a slide deck, and then I'm actually going to show you how to get going in a live demo. So the first thing you would like to do probably is install the CLI. So to do that, you would go into your command line and run npm install global Amplify CLI. To initialize a new Amplify project, you would need to go in the working directory of whatever application you're working in and just run amplify init. Amplify init will scaffold a complete Amplify project and get it ready to go for you so you can then start adding different services from there. Now that the Amplify project has been initialized, you can start adding features. So to add a feature such as authorization, you can simply run amplify add auth from your command line. That will go ahead and scaffold some authorization code for you and kind of get the local configuration ready to go. Once you have whatever services you'd like to have had added locally, you can then start interacting with them using the AWS Amplify Client Library. So inside the same project where you initialize the actual Amplify CLI project, you can then install AWS Amplify, which is the JavaScript library, to your local environment. And then once Amplify is installed, we can start using it. If you're using a JavaScript framework-specific library that you'd like to also add, you can install that as well. So if you're in a React project, you can install AWS Amplify React. If you're in an Angular or an Ionic project, you can install AWS Amplify Angular. Once your local dependencies are installed, you can start using them. So in this example here, we're importing auth from AWS Amplify. Auth is going to allow us to do all the different authentication stuff using Amazon Cognito. And then we can start interacting with the services once we have auth available in the scope. So if we'd like to sign in a user, we can call auth.signin, passing in the username and the password. Sign in returns a promise. If the promise is successful, we'll just log out that we've successfully signed the user in. And then in a typical app, you would probably do some routing there. And then if there's an error, we'll simply just log out the error. If you'd like to learn more about the actual API behind this, auth actually has over 30 different methods. The AWS Amplify GitHub documentation and our actual documentation site has a really good rundown of all of the different APIs that are available and how they all work. So to kind of summarize what AWS Amplify is aiming to do, it's basically a tool chain for the client that greatly lowers the barrier to entry for developers and companies looking to build full stack applications. And when we say lower the barrier to entry, typically for startups or just companies in general, hiring and managing developers right now is very expensive. So building out all of these services from scratch, such as authentication and different APIs and things like that, is kind of expensive if you'd like to just be experimenting with different things. So for instance, if you do want to have your own authentication service, building all of this from scratch would take a lot of developer hours. Well, what you can do with Amplify is kind of take advantage of a bunch of different managed services, and instead of having to build them from scratch, you get to try things out. If things work, you scale up, you get more users. If they don't work, you haven't invested a lot of time and money rebuilding something that's kind of already out there. So what we'll do next is we'll look at how to actually get up and running from scratch in a new application. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my command line now, and what we're going to do is we're going to create a new project using the Amplify CLI. We're going to install a brand new React application. We're going to scaffold a couple of services from the Amplify CLI, and then we're going to connect our application to these services to kind of show you how to get up and running with Amplify. So we're at our command line, and I'm just going to run ls to show you that we're inside of an empty directory. The first thing I'd like to do, though, is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and create a new React application. So I'm going to call create React app, and I'll call this Amplify webinar. All right, so now we've created our new React project. I'm going to go ahead and change into that directory. And now that we're inside of the directory, we can start initializing our Amplify project. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run amplify init. And this is going to walk us through the steps that we need to create this new Amplify project. So for the name of the project, I'll call this Amplify Webinar, or AmpWeb. For the default text editor, I like to use Visual Studio Code. If yours is here, you can choose it. If it's not, just choose none. For the type of application that we're going to be building, we're not building a native app. We're going to be working in JavaScript, so I'm just going to choose that. Now for the JavaScript framework that we're using, I'm in a React app, so I'm going to go ahead and choose React. For the source directory path, this is kind of just asking where our entry point for the application is. In a new React application, we have an src directory, and that's the default, so I'm just going to choose source as the default source directory path. Next, for the distribution directory path, this is going to be the path for the project once it's been built. So once we actually run npm run build or whatever your build command is, whatever path that actual code gets created and put in, that's the path we're going to use. For a React app, that's also build, so I'm just going to go ahead and choose that. The build command is by default npm run build, so I'm going to leave the default there as well. If yours is different, feel free to kind of just put in whatever your build command is. The start command for React is npm run start, so I'll choose that as the default as well. Next, because I am using this as a brand new user, it's going to ask us if we'd like to set up a new user. If you've set up an Amplify project already, and this is like your second, you can actually just use your existing user. But since I'm kind of showing this as coming from a completely new user, I'm going to go ahead and set up a new user. So I'm going to go ahead and choose yes for set up new user, and this is going to open up the AWS Console and the IAM Console and allow us to kind of walk through a couple of steps to create a new IAM user. So what we've seen here is it goes ahead and opens the AWS console, and if you're brand new to AWS, you're going to need to create an account. If you already have an AWS account, just log in and just leave this screen open for now and then jump back to the CLI. All right, so now that our console is open, I'm going to go ahead and choose Enter. And for the AWS region, I'm going to use US East 1. Feel free to use the region that you like to use or that you're closest to. Now it's going to ask us for the username because we're going to be creating a new IAM user. And for the IAM user, I'm going to call this Amplify Test Webinar. Now, since we already have the AWS console open and we're logged in, then it's going to go ahead and redirect us to the IAM User Generation tab. Actually, let me zoom back out. So in the IAM console, it automatically fills out the username for us and the access type. So we can just keep all of these defaults because this is exactly how we'd like it to be. We'll click Next Permissions. It's going to automatically choose the proper policy that we'd like to use, Administrator Access. So now we can just click Next Review. And it's going to kind of give us an overview of the new user. I'm just going to go ahead and choose Create User because everything looks good to me. And now our user has been created, and we're going to be given some information that we're going to need to continue setting up our CLI. So what we're going to need is the access key ID and the secret access key. This is some information that you're only going to be given once. So if you want to keep up with it later for a later time, you need to go ahead and maybe save this in a file somewhere or download it. I'm going to go ahead and first copy the access key ID to my clipboard, and then I'm going to jump back into the CLI to enter this information in. So here we're prompted for that access key ID that I just copied to my clipboard. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that here. Next, we're asked for our secret access key. So I can jump back to the console, show that, and copy it as well. Then I'm going to jump back to the command line and paste that here and hit Enter. Next, it's asking us if we'd like to save this profile locally for later use. I'm just going to choose no for now because I'm not really interested in doing that. And next, it's going to ask us if we'd like to set up a project-specific configuration. So what we've done just now, entering our secret access key and our access key ID, is we've created like a Amplify project-wide configuration for future projects, but we can also specify a specific user just for this project. But since we've already kind of created a user, I don't want to set up a new user again. So I'm going to choose no to take that existing user that we just created there. So that's the steps that we need to do to initialize a new project. So now it's going to take a few seconds, and it's going to go ahead and create some IAM roles for us in our AWS account. And this might take a couple of seconds. And then once all of this process is done, we can now start adding new services using the Amplify CLI and continuing to use the Amplify CLI. So now we'll get a message that says your project has been successfully initialized and connected to the cloud. So what we can do next is start adding new services. So the first service that I'm going to add is authentication. So to do that, I'm going to run amplify add auth, and I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. We get prompted for a question. Do you want to use the default authentication and security configuration? So what you can do is you can kind of take a set of pre-configured defaults and go with them, and they're actually a pretty good set starting point for a lot of applications. Or you can choose no, and you can actually set all of the different settings by hand, one by one. I'm just going to go ahead and use the default configuration, which is basically going to ask us when we sign up for a username, an email, a password, and a phone number, and it's going to do multi-factor authentication for a sign-up. And then once we've signed up, we can just sign in using our email and our password. I'm sorry, I think it's our username and our password. So I'm going to go ahead and choose yes. And now we've had authentication that's been added successfully. So the last thing we need to do is just run Amplify Push to push this new configuration that we've added locally back to our AWS account. And it's going to just ask us if we'd like to continue, giving us a little information about what we're about to do. And basically, you can look at the operation that says create and the category for auth, and that's really what's going to happen here. The operation is going to create a new auth category, which is going to be Amazon Cognito. I'll go ahead and choose yes. Okay, so once the resources have been successfully created, you'll get a message that says all resources are updated and in the cloud. So now our authorization resources have been completely initialized and we're ready to start using them. So there's two things we'll probably do now. The first is we'll look in the AWS console and kind of just check out the new resource that was created so we know that it's there. And we also know where to go if we want to kind of look at different information about the resource as we start adding and signing up new users. And then next, we'll go ahead and create a new piece of functionality within our React app that allows users to start signing up and signing into our app. So if we scroll up into the creation process of this new service, and we go back to the original Amplify Push right here, we're going to see that we have a resource name, and the resource name is Cognito D, and we have a bunch of characters after that. When we go in our Amazon Cognito console, this is going to be the resource name that we're going to go ahead and be looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll back down, and I'm going to go ahead and open the AWS console. In the AWS console, I'm going to go ahead and click on Services, and I'm going to search for Cognito. Once we're in the Cognito console, I'm going to click on Manage User Pools. And now we see that we have our new service here, Cognito D5A, with the string of the project that we had locally. It kind of correlates to this. And here we can start seeing different information. And what we're going to look at is users and groups. Because when we sign up a new user, we're going to be able to come back here and see the user information of whatever users we have signed up. So now that we know that the service is there and we kind of know how to look at it, let's go back to our code and start writing some actual JavaScript to start interacting with this. I'm going to go back to my command line, and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code to open the code editor. So inside the JavaScript project, inside the React app, I'm going to go ahead and open the source folder, and I'm going to go ahead and open a couple of files. I'm going to open index.js, app.js, and we're going to see a new file that was auto-generated for us called AWS-exports.js. So the first file we're going to look at is AWS Exports.js. So we never really created this file by hand. This was automatically generated for us using the Amplify CLI. And this really is something we're not going to be changing ourselves. This is going to be completely managed by the CLI, but we're going to need this file to configure our app. We're going to be calling a function called amplify.configure and passing a reference to this file. So I just kind of wanted to show you that it was there and why it's there. So I'm going to go ahead and close it now. And we're going to open index.js. This is going to be where we're going to be calling the amplify.configure function. And if you remember in the initial setup, we installed the Amplify library as well as the Amplify React library if we were using a React application. And if you look at our package.json, you'll notice that we don't really have that installed yet because we haven't installed it yet, and it's not something that's installed for you. So let's go back to our command line, and I'm going to go to the command line directly from the VS Code editor so we don't have to keep switching back and forth. And from here, I'm going to go ahead and use Yarn to add the AWS Amplify and AWS Amplify React libraries. And Yarn is a drop-in replacement for NPM. So you could also run npm install AWS Amplify and npm install AWS Amplify React. So once those packages have been installed, I'll go ahead and close my terminal. And now I can go ahead and import Amplify from AWS Amplify. And next, I'll go ahead and import a reference to that AWS Exports.js file that I'll call config. And I'll just reference the file path, AWS Exports. And now we can call amplify.configure and pass in the config. Amplify.configure is going to go ahead and configure our project at a root location. That's why we're using index.js. It only needs to be called once in the entire project, and we can now start using Amplify anywhere else in the project. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to app.js, and we're going to use our first service. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and import a component called with Authenticator. And this comes from the AWS Amplify React library. We looked at the auth class that comes from AWS Amplify, where we can do things like call auth.signin and auth.signup. What with Authenticator does, it packages up an entire authentication flow, and we can just call with Authenticator and wrap whatever component we would like to protect with authorization. So it's like a pre-configured flow, and it's a good way to get started with authentication without having to write a lot of code. And all we need to do is wrap the app component with the with Authenticator higher order component. And if you've ever set up a React app is the app class that's auto-generated is the entry point to the app. So basically what's going to happen is our entire main entry point is going to be now protected with authentication. And the only thing we need to do now is go ahead and run the app. So when you're working with the React, the run script is npm start. So let's go ahead and run npm start to see if this is working. So I've opened the terminal in VS Code again, and I'm just going to go ahead and run npm start. So now our React app is launched, and you'll see that we do not actually see our app component, but instead we see a sign in form. And we can either sign in, sign up, or we can actually click forgot password if we've forgotten our password. But since we've never signed anyone up yet, let's go ahead and sign up real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and click sign up. And this is going to ask us for our username, password, email, and phone number. So the phone number is going to be important because this is going to be for multi-factor authentication. So you're going to basically receive a text message with an authorization code that you're going to need to actually sign up the user. So let's go ahead and sign up and see if this works properly. And we'll go ahead and click sign up. You should receive a confirmation code to the phone number you provided. So I'll go ahead and put that in here. For me, that's 663218. So I'll go ahead and click confirm. And if that's successful, you should go ahead and be redirected to the sign-in form. So now I'll go ahead and sign in. And once you've successfully signed in, you will then be redirected to the main app component, which is going to just show this welcome to React. And to get started, you can edit the source/app.js file. So using that just single with Authenticator component has added quite a bit of functionality to our app. You can, again, either write your own from scratch auth and you would do that using the auth class, but you can also kind of edit this with Authenticator using a few different params and properties to kind of customize it a little bit, but there's only a certain point that you can get to with this with Authenticator, however, component. And if you'd like full customization, you're probably gonna need to write it from scratch using the auth class and calling sign in, sign up, and things like that. So let's go now to Amazon Cognito and take a look and see if this user is now there. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump back to the AWS console into the Cognito console that we opened just a moment ago. So back into the Cognito console, and I'm gonna go ahead and click refresh in the top right corner in users and groups to see if our new user is now available. When we click refresh, we see a new user has been added, and we can see their username, we can see their status, and we can see different information, metadata about them as well. If we click on that, we can get their sub, which is their unique identifier, and a bunch of other information that you might need about the user. You can also disable and delete the user if you'd like by just clicking here and then clicking delete user. I'm not gonna do that. We're gonna be needing this user in just a moment to do some other things. So now that we have a user initialized and we have user sign up enabled, let's now add another piece of functionality. Let's look at how to add analytics and call custom events from the app. So I'll go back to my actual JavaScript code, and we're gonna create a function that calls an analytics event to start recording information. So I'll go ahead and maybe keep this terminal window open, and I'll just minimize it a little bit. And we're gonna go ahead and import a new component called analytics. And this is also gonna be from the Amplify library, but it's not gonna be from Amplify React. It's gonna be directly from AWS Amplify. Now, if you remember correctly, the only service that we've added so far has been the only service we've added so far has been Amazon Cognito. So we now need to add Amazon Pinpoint for analytics to work. So let's go to our command line, and we're gonna go ahead and add that new service from here. So inside the main directory of the app, I'm gonna run amplify add analytics. And it's gonna ask us for the it's gonna ask us for the Pinpoint resource name. It's gonna give us a default, mine is amp web. I think that sounds good to me. I'm just gonna go ahead and click enter. It's gonna ask us if we'd like to allow guests and unauthenticated users to send analytics events. I'm gonna go ahead and choose yes. And it's gonna ask us if we can overwrite an existing file that's part of our configuration. We're gonna need to go ahead and choose yes to do this, and we're gonna just allow the CLI to update whatever resources we need without us having to worry about it. And after that's been initialized, we can then run Amplify Push again. And we'll see that we have a new operation for creation, for analytics, and the resource name is amp web. So we'll go ahead and choose yes if we'd like to continue. All right, great. So if that was successful, you'll get a message that says all resources are updated in the cloud, and we can now start using this analytics class. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a function called record event. And this is just gonna call analytics.record. And analytics.record takes a couple of different arguments. We can pass in a name, which will be the name of the event. And for this, I'll just call this test event 1. You can also pass attributes. So for the attributes, this is gonna be an object, and I'm gonna give this some information, some metadata maybe about the user. I'm gonna say username, and I'll just pass in a string here for my username. We could also, now that we have authentication enabled, we could import the auth class and call auth.current authenticated user to get the information about the actual user dynamically, so we don't have to hard code this. But for now, since we're just doing a demo, I'm just gonna hard code the username. So record event is gonna call analytics.record, giving us a name and an attributes value. So what I'll do is I'll now attach this event to a event handler. So I'll go ahead and delete this getting started, to get started edit header or paragraph from our actual code. And instead I'll replace it with a button. And this button will just say record event. And for the on-click handler, I'll pass this dot record event. And I'll go ahead and click save. And maybe also in the record event, I'll go ahead and just console.log about to record event. So we make sure we know that this button is actually firing. So once we've written our code, let's jump back to the React app. I'm gonna go ahead and open the console and open up the actual JavaScript console in our internet browser to make sure we can look at the different information that's being logged out. So we have this new record event button. I'm gonna go ahead and click it, and we're gonna see something logged out that says about to record event. So that's good. We know that the actual button event is firing. So I'll go ahead and click that a few different times. And what we're gonna do next is we're gonna go and we're gonna log into the Amazon Pinpoint Console, and we're gonna look at this new resource that was created, and we're gonna see if the actual event has been recorded. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the AWS console. And from the AWS console, we're gonna need to navigate, well, let me go back from there. And from the AWS console, we're gonna go ahead and need to navigate to Pinpoint. So I'll go ahead and search for Pinpoint and click on Pinpoint. In the Pinpoint console, we're gonna see a listing of all the different projects that we've worked on. At the bottom left corner for me, I see this AMP web project, and that's the project that we're gonna be looking at here. And in the left-hand corner, we have a bunch of different things that we can do. What we'd like to do though is we'd like to look at the events that are available that have been recorded. Excuse me. So I'll go ahead and click on events. And now we can see all of the events that have been registered from our app. And we have a timing for the last 30 days. We have a drop down for all the different event types. So I'll go ahead and click that. And we see that we have this session start event. And this is the session event that I was talking about earlier. So when you install analytics, you automatically start getting session information. So if you have a dozen different users that are using your app, you'll see that you have all of those dozen users registering events without you really having to write any code. But the event we'd like to actually look closer into is this test event 1. And this is the event that we created manually. And we click the button 3 times. So we see that we have the event has registered 3 times totally, which is perfect because that's actually true. But we also have this attributes that we can drill down and look into. And the attribute that we added was the username. So if we click on username, we can actually see that now we have some metadata about the user that was actually triggering that event. And once that pulls up, you'll see that my username, Dabbit3, was in charge of triggering that event. And from here, you can do different analytics calculations for whatever information you'd like to pull out from your application. But with Pinpoint, all of this information is actually also accessible from an external API. So you can do things, you can do more complex GET requests and things like that for information about your Pinpoint analytics for whatever application you're using without actually having to do it manually through the console. So what we've done so far is we've created a new Amplify CLI project. We've installed the Amplify library to a React app, and we've looked at how to interact with 2 different services, authorization and authentication using Amazon Cognito, and then sending events and working with event data from Amazon Pinpoint. Again, there are a bunch of different services that you can also work with, like GraphQL APIs, Lambda Functions, and S3. So I encourage you to look at the AWS Amplify documentation if you're interested in learning more about Amplify. And I hope that you've learned a lot from this webinar. And if you have any questions, we're going to be doing a Q&A. And I'd love to see any questions that anyone has about whatever ideas you have about what we just went over today. And thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate your time.